All right, so this chapter starts out by talking a little bit incongruously about Nat Turner. Anyone remember from your history classes who Nat Turner was, or why he mattered, why he was important? He was pre-Civil War. Ring a bell to anybody? He led a slave rebellion. After he led his rebellion, they really cracked down, and codes became much more oppressive for African Americans. Nat Turner was also a preacher, and he preached a sort of apocalyptic type of folk Christianity. That was part of his rebellion. Turner is seen by many as being sort of a founding figure or an emblem for a particular approach to dealing with racism, dealing with segregation, dealing with slavery, dealing with all that legacy. That's why the book places him first in here. And then the book starts talking about separatism. And it's going to spend a little bit of time going over that. When we talk about separatism, what do we mean in terms of ethnic separatism? If you put aside African American stuff and just think in terms of some of the separatist movements going on today, what do they always want? I mean, it's in the word. What are their aims? You know, the globe has changed since you guys were kids. There's new countries that didn't exist when you were in elementary school. Oftentimes coming from separatist movements. What do they want? Yeah.
Their own identity.
Their own
identity.
Well, they usually think they've got their own identity. What else do they?
They want to be acknowledged as such. By everyone.
Okay. So they want their own land, their own country, their own institutions, and sometimes it'll be worked out within a larger society. So separatism could be living in a particular place in America, but not actually trying to have your own nation. It's very tough to get nation status in America. Ever since the Civil War, they really don't go for that sort of thing. Or it might be actually trying to say, well, people of this group need to be in a completely separate place. And separatism took different forms like that. I mean, there have been in the 1970s, there were calls to set aside 6 states for African Americans, and all the whites should relocate out of those states, and all the African Americans should locate in those states. That was part of black separatism in the 1970s. Totally unworkable proposition, but it gives you an idea of what was going on. One of the separatist ideas was the "Back to Africa" refrain, and sometimes this was by racist whites who are saying, we should send the former slaves back to Africa, get them out of the South. That'll take care of all the racial problems. Sometimes it was on the part of blacks themselves. For instance, those who went back to Liberia and founded a country there, which had its own problems afterwards. Led to the caste system of the Americans versus the natives there. What would be opposed to separatism? Your book doesn't really do a good job of bringing up this contrast. Somebody like Marcus Garvey would be a hardcore separatist. Yeah?
Like unification?
Well, unification is like everybody's the same. So, if we did a unification thing, everybody should be a college professor like me and study philosophy. That's not going to work. What's in between unification and everybody's got to go their separate ways?
Like cohesiveness?
Okay. The word that usually gets used is integration. But cohesiveness is a good word to use as well. Integration, having an integrated society means that you have members. If we're thinking in terms of race, it would be, all the different races are able to be represented. people can move from place to place without fear that their racial identity is going to be used against them. Doesn't have to be like, the proverbial Benetton ad where there's a quota system and you have to have, like one person of each race represented in every single place. As a matter of fact, college brochures often get made fun of for that reason too, because they often try to do that sort of thing. But the idea is that it's not that race wouldn't matter at all, but it wouldn't be an impediment. It wouldn't be something that would allow people to hold things against each other. That's a goal. So these are two different goals. These are two different responses to the problem of originally slavery. But the core that this is based on is racism. Even the notion that there are indeed completely separate races rather than a human race is an expression of racism in that respect. So, who would be an example of somebody that you could think of who would be for integration rather than separatism? Think about, Black history. Yeah.
Martin Luther King.
Yeah, he would be a great example of that. And if you wanted to oppose somebody else around the same time, maybe Malcolm X. This is a traditional way. Yeah, this is an essay thing we often give to undergraduates to write. Discuss the difference between integration and separatism. Malcolm X later on repudiated that, as we're going to see. So we've got a lot of different things going on. Why are we talking about new urban religions? Because this really doesn't become a major factor until the mass migrations from the American South up to the northern cities of African Americans who are getting out of the South because, frankly, the South is underdeveloped at that time and shot through and through with segregation and racism, and they thought they had a lot better prospects in the northern cities. So they move up to Chicago, Detroit, New York, Boston, all across this northern tier. And your book talks first about Marcus Garvey. So Marcus Garvey, he would be in the separatist side. He establishes the Universal Negro Improvement Association, and they had as their aim the creation of an entirely black society and culture that would abandon the New World and restore American blacks to their ancestral home in Africa. And so what Garvey did is created like an entire ideology, like your book talks about, a broad network of symbols and organizations. And there were some examples of how this got incorporated with the African Orthodox Church. Garvey himself is not successful, but Garvey gets a lot of things rolling. His ideas are taking on shape in these other thinkers. Then your book talks about some other figures that don't quite fit in so well with the thing having to do with race so much, but they're coming out of these northern cities. And your book talks about Father Divine. Father Divine was this founder of a peace mission movement in New York. And if you want to place him in this spectrum, he would be integrationist. He preached racial, an overcoming of racial divisions. He had both black and white followers. A lot of his followers were actually women who had been experimenting with other religious movements. And quite a few people taught that he was, sort of God on earth. They didn't have an awful lot of theology. The movement after he dies doesn't have a lot of impetus, and it's gradually dying out. Another guy that they talk about is Charles Emmanuel Grace, called himself Sweet Daddy Grace, who starts the United House of Prayer for All People. He attracts a lot of followers from the sanctified, the holiness and Pentecostal churches. And part of what he's particularly known for is making claims about products. He had an entire line of soap, magazines, cold cream, toothpaste. All these sort of things were supposed to cleanse a person spiritually. And again, charismatic figure, oftentimes once the main figure is gone, the organization doesn't do so well, and they're sort of just languishing along at this time. So that's talking about sort of some early stuff, and then some more or less within the Christian line kind of stuff. If we want to think about black nationalism or black separatism, we also want to talk in terms of Islam. Interestingly enough, when we're talking about African American Islam, we have to think in terms of, and we'll talk more about what this means later. Sunni Islam, sort of mainstream Islam is practiced in most, the countries where Islam is a major factor, ranging from Indonesia all the way over to Morocco. Or we can talk in terms of black Islamic movements. So we have to go one of two ways. And this is one of the dilemmas for African American Muslims. The black Islamic movements that are going to come about, until there's a lot of Islamic immigration, really are the big face of Islam within the United States. But to the mainstream Islamic world, they're considered to be heterodox. That means they're not considered to be genuinely Muslim. They're considered to have done some strange deviations, to have gone their own way. Usually in terms of having committed shirk or having set something else as God other than just Allah. So there's kind of a dilemma here. This is something actually that I saw when I was working in Indiana State Prison. It's also something that Malcolm X himself had to deal with. Sunni Islam is multicultural in the sense that it spans races. It's not multicultural in the sense that we associate with like multiculturalism, saying anything goes, everybody's culture is just as good, because they don't think that. But it spans races, nations, eras. You can't effectively be a racist within the American setting and be a Sunni Muslim if you really take Sunni Islam seriously, because to belong to it, it's sort of like belonging to the Catholic Church. To belong to the Catholic Church means belonging to a church that includes people of every single race, coming from everywhere. And Sunni Islam is really like that. There are converts and long-standing, generational members from every single race you can think of these days. So, if you want to be a separatist and say that somehow, the African Americans should be totally separate because, racism or because they're better or something like that, you're not going to be able to be a Sunni Muslim. This is why Malcolm X abandons his view on race, because he becomes a Sunni Muslim. The black Islamic movements would be things like the Moorish Science Temple, or the Nation of Islam, or offshoots like the 5% Nation, 5%ers, bless you, the Nation of Gods. There's a lot of different offshoots of these. All of them have in common taking some things from traditional Islam, but adding some things to it. So, for example, the Moorish Science Temple, which is founded by this guy, Drew Ali, he taught that blacks were really Asians and therefore Moors were Muslims. So there's this entire sort of backstory having to do with where race came from for these. in the Nation of Islam, you're going to get this whole story about blacks being the original people, whites being created. There's a couple different versions of this, being created by an evil scientist, whites taking over, and eventually there'll be a world in which that's taken care of and there are no more whites, and everything will be back in harmony again. But that's not traditional Islam. And as a matter of fact, Drew Ali actually adds his own things to the Quran. So the Moorish Science Temple Quran is not the same thing as the Quran that you're going to find in a Sunni mosque. The Moorish Science Temple is the one that gets things started. They're not that successful after Drew leaves. In part because there's a lot of infighting over who should actually be the successor. This is something that you see in charismatic movements. You have a leader, they bring about a lot of new ideas, and then after they die or go off the scene, there's always this question about who should be in charge, who is the real successor to them. The Nation of Islam ends up largely supplanting them as the dynamic force within the African American communities. And that gets started by this guy, W.D. Fard Muhammad. He establishes a temple and a set of teachings, activities, and institutions in Detroit. His place is taken by Elijah Muhammad, and Elijah Muhammad leads the Nation of Islam to sort of national prominence. Now, like your book points out, Malcolm X plays an important role in here. He's a major spokesperson for the Nation of Islam until he does something particularly important for Muslims. Has anybody ever read the autobiography of Malcolm X? No? Big book when I was a kid. You have?
Yeah, he went on Hajj to Mecca.
Very good. Yeah. So this is something we're going to talk a little bit more about when we talk about Islam, particularly Sunni Islam in America. One thing Muslims are supposed to do, if they can, if they have the resources during their lifetime, is go on a pilgrimage to Mecca. So Malcolm X goes on this pilgrimage to Mecca, and what does he see when he is, observing these crowds circling around the Kaaba? They're all different races. So he realizes that Orthodox traditional Islam is not going to allow for this racist interpretation that he's got. So he converts to Sunni Islam, and he ends up getting shot. That doesn't go well for him. There's other things that take place as well within the Nation of Islam. Elijah Muhammad's son, Wallace Deen Muhammad, after Elijah Muhammad dies, when he takes over, he actually does a similar kind of shift. And he changes the name to the American Muslim Mission. The current Nation of Islam that exists today is really a splinter group from the original Nation of Islam, and it's Louis Farrakhan who is the driving member in that. Now, what do they actually stand for? Your book has a nice summary of this. It says, the nation can be understood as systematically attempting to raise American blacks out of the social and personal disorganization of ghetto life, particularly in the northern cities, and to instill instead a collective sense of pride and achievement through a puritanically disciplined lifestyle. One thing that, if you see the Nation of Islam members, you can count on them to be pretty disciplined, to have a very strict code that they're going to follow. They rejected traditional soul food, all stimulants and intoxicants in favor of a nutritious regimen, marital fidelity, collective ownership of small businesses and farming enterprises, and as thoroughgoing a rejection and avoidance of white society as possible. So this is part of the separatist idea. Separatism really only works if you have some sort of driving moral force behind it. And the Nation of Islam was able to do that. In recent years, your book doesn't actually talk about this much because it's fairly recent. The Nation of Islam has actually started incorporating some practices from the Church of Scientology, including using the book Dianetics and doing some of the practices. That really has not gone over well with traditional Muslims because they they already thought the Nation of Islam was pretty heterodox. That sort of capped it for them. The last group that your book talks about, and I won't put it up on the board just to save a little time, are the Rastafarians. What do you guys associate Rastafarians with, or Rastas? There's sort of a mainstream image of them.
Jamaica.
Right? So, you know, green, black, and yellow, right? What else? Yeah.
Like Bob Marley and like dreadlocks and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Reggae music. The dreadlocks was originally primarily a Rasta thing, then it caught on and a lot of people started doing it. What else? Anything else? Yeah.
Smoking weed.
Yeah, the name ganja comes from the Rastafarians. And it has a sort of sacramental significance for them. The Rastafarian movement is actually, if you want to be very technical about it, it fits within sort of the black Jewish movements. So it starts in Jamaica, and you know we started talking about Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey plays a role in this. Marcus Garvey had a prophecy that a black king would be crowned in Africa in the near future. So this actually happens in Ethiopia, which at that time is one of the few independent African nations. All the rest of them had more or less been colonized, except for Liberia. And Rastafari Makonnen is crowned Emperor of Ethiopia, takes the name Haile Selassie, power of the Holy Trinity in Ethiopian. And so a lot of Jamaican ministers start preaching the message throughout the island. They saw Selassie as a messiah for black people in general, a sort of pan-African thing throughout the Caribbean, America, Africa, and a descendant of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. So really what we've got here is a variation on black Judaism. There's other variations on this as well that your book doesn't talk about, like the Hebrew Israelite movements, things like that. But, you know, again, in order to save time, we'll not go into those.